Great. So I'm going to take Christian Dior as a case study, really, because as Shahada mentioned, we have an exhibition at the V&A at the moment, and so really looking at a case study for Paris fashion over the past 70 plus years. And so the 12th of February 1947 is a fabled moment in fashion history because at 10:30 a.m. in the morning, Christian Dior opened the doors of his couture house for the first time. And really, fashion had been in the doldrums in Paris since the end of the war. Everybody was really looking for something new and exciting to come from there. And there was a lot of buzz about this new designer. And of course, fashion is important in France. It's very embedded in the culture. There's a wonderful industry there. To give you some idea, in 1939, at the start of the war, there were 300,000 people working in the fashion trades and ancillary industries. So really very important. And the British author Nancy Mitford, great Francophile, spoke about the fact that even the taxi drivers were talking about this new designer, and there was a real buzz around this collection. So Dior delivered. He came out with a new collection. He moved away from the boxy silhouettes of the war years with square shoulders and shorter skirts, and introduced a sloping shoulder line, a tiny waist, padded hips, and a skirt which fell to mid-calf length. So the fashion press were ecstatic. There was wonderful reviews, and the American editor Carmel Snow of Harper's Bazaar coined this look the new look, and the name stuck. So there was also controversy. The new look was seen as a sort of flagrant display of luxury in an age where there was still a lot of hardship. In Britain, the head of the Board of Trade, Sir Stafford Cripps, called in the fashion journalists and asked them not to report on this because he was worried about a run in materials. Rationing was still in place. And so this was very foremost in his mind. And it's very interesting to read the press reports that came out of that. The V&A's fashion expert, James Laver, at the time, said that he was very worried about the longer length because it threw a focus on the ankles and feet, which were not a British woman's strong point. So in France, when Dior went on his first trip there, he arrived at the end of 1947, he was met with protesters, women with placards in Chicago, which read, "Mr. Dior, we abhor your dresses to the floor." So really, mixed responses, but very much an important moment, and the new look was really here to stay and would crystallize the look of fashion for the coming decade. So the look of Dior, the signature look of his house, was sort of coined by Vogue, who attended the first show, American Vogue, and they said it wasn't about an easy little dress and it wasn't about theatricality. This was about a deep knowledge of dressmaking and a sophisticated way of wearing these clothes. And for Dior, this look was deeply embedded in and influenced by his idea of the Parisienne. And this lay in his love of the period of his early childhood, which he often spoke about, the Belle Époque, when Parisian society and culture sort of reached a high point of sophistication and artifice. And he stated he felt so lucky to live through this time, and he recalled the elaborate clothing of his mother. You can see in the slide here above, on your left-hand side, Madeleine Dior. He talked about how she had these wonderful clothes and how she would breeze through, leaving a trail of perfume behind her. Dior's own muse was a lady called Mitza Bricard, and she was kind of a mysterious character who had a shadowy past. But she had worked at the house of Molyneux, another fashion house, and Dior had met her when she was first there, and he was just transfixed by her. She apparently lived only for elegance, and he talked about her sort of inimitable extravagances of taste and how that inspired him. And the Vogue editor, Bettina Ballard, said that Mitza Bricard was the ultimate Parisienne, down to her very soul. No one was more Parisian than Mitza. So she really has a big influence on Dior and the look of fashion. In 1955, another couturier, Jacques Heim, he acknowledged the importance of the Parisian to the haute couture, and he stated, "The couturier shapes the aspirations and dreams of millions of women, but from where does he get his unusual power? He draws from his experience, which is dressing the most elegant women of Paris. To them, he owes everything." So, rooted in Paris, Dior was very conscious that in order to sustain and grow his business, he really needed a global model. And he not only revolutionized fashion design, but he also was incredibly radical in his approach to business. Along with his business manager, Jacques Rouet, he really transformed the way fashion was done. In 1948, he opened a high-end, ready-to-wear version of the haute couture house in New York. So this would be versions of the Paris haute couture pieces, but they would be retailed in specific department stores. He did the same in 1952 when he opened CD models in London, creating the same and retailing in department stores such as Harrods and Kendall Milne and Marshall and Snellgrove. He also opened a branch in Caracas in Venezuela. He had a branch in Casablanca in Morocco. He traveled to Australia and did deals with department stores there. He also did deals with department stores in Japan. So we're really global market and opening up the haute couture to a much wider audience, albeit still a quite wealthy audience. The brilliance lay in his approach to licensing. So he set up an unusual model whereby he would grant a license, but only for a period of 1 year. And he would visit the factories, he would look at the standard of the product that was being created, and if it slipped in any way, they would revoke the licensing immediately. So with this model, and with the couture house as a sort of jewel in his crown, Christian Dior could really play to the aspirational market and selling perfume, stockings, costume jewelry to millions of people seduced by the allure of the Paris haute couture house. By 1956, his influence was, incredible, and you can see not only in fashion magazines. I don't know if this is this slide here on the left. This is from the Picture Post. So he's really looking, at this middle market here. The Picture Post isn't specifically fashion, but it deals with fashion, and it's this idea of the Trickle-Down Theory. So the Picture Post is saying to its readers, how many Dior lines have you worn in the last 9 years? So essentially, you didn't realize it, but everything you've been wearing has been coming from Christian Dior. In 1957, Dior appeared on the cover of Time magazine. Sadly, that was the year that he died at the age of 52. He was just at the helm of his house for only 10 years, but he had really become a global force and a global name. He was, his assistant, Yves Saint Laurent, took over the reins of the house at just 21 years of age, and he was then replaced by Marc Bohan at the beginning of the 1960s, and Marc Bohan had a long tenure of 29 years, and he really steered the House of Dior through a difficult period when ready-to-wear becomes the leading edge and force in fashion, and I know Jenny's going to speak to that later on. So, in 1984, a French businessman, Bernard Arnault, was visiting New York and found himself in the back of a cab. When he mentioned he was French, the taxi driver turned to him and said, "I don't speak French, but I can say Christian Dior." And Arnault had realized, that the house was actually up for sale at the time, and Arnault suddenly had this moment. It was an epiphany. He said he realized that, the power and global reach of this brand was really quite significant. So he returned to Paris and he bought the House of Dior, and he set about sort of changing it and modernizing it. And one of the things he did was to bring in a new designer in 1989 called Gianfranco Ferré. And there was huge consternation about this in the press because Ferré was Italian. And at the time, Italy and France were really having a standoff as to see who was, supreme in the fashion game. And it's very interesting to read these reports, people saying, how could an Italian take over such an important French house? But Ferré does a very good job of it. He brings a sense of drama back to the House of Dior, and he really positions Dior back at the center of fashion and in a really important space within the fashion media too. So following on from that, Dior has really retained this sort of space in fashion folklore and positioning. Through the years of John Galliano, these extravagant highs, the chic minimalism of Raf Simons, who followed him, and the very dynamic contemporary approach of Maria Grazia Chiuri, the designer who's there today. So really we have an Englishman, a Belgian, and an Italian. And they've all spoken of the magic of being at this fabled Parisian house to which no other can compare in terms of legacy. It is Paris, and it is fashion, I would say. And lastly, the return of Christian Dior last summer, another Englishman, Kim Jones, who took over the menswear, and he opened his show with this giant sculpture made of roses of Christian Dior and his beloved dog, Bobby. Thank you.